work with someone like you? And I said, because the best always are looking for that little bit of difference that's going to make them that much ahead of the competition, and are constantly working, never think that they've gotten there.
Welcome to Voices and Visionaries, the podcast featuring the female forces in sports media. I'm Kelly Burke, and joining me today is Kathleen Hessert, a strategic communications expert specializing in sports marketing, branding, and social media. Kathleen is the founder and owner of We Are Gen Z and the Sports Media Challenge. She is also a renowned speaker, an influencer, and a former TV news anchor and NASCAR pit reporter. Kathleen, I'm so glad that our mutual friend Trevor Turnbull could connect us. How are you?
I'm just doing great, thank you. Despite the lockdown, I'm doing great.
That's wonderful to hear. Congratulations is in order because you recently launched Brand Breakdown in partnership with Game Plan. And that's a new series that educates student athletes about how to amplify their own brand. As part of that program, what are some of the overarching themes that you are teaching these student athletes about branding?
Well, it's really, I'm thrilled to be able to do this. And this is the first for them. And obviously it's a lead up to the NIL legislation, the name, image, and likeness legislation, and what that means for student athletes being able to market themselves. But the reality is that they don't know how to build a brand. They don't, they know that people know who they are, but that doesn't mean they have a brand. There's a vast difference between image and brand, and even exposure and brand. And so this whole series, Brand Breakdown, is about helping them, figure out why they want a brand, what it's going to take. Something as simple as, who's your audience? Who do you want to reach, and how? And it's a matter of taking innovation to the next level for them and understanding what it's going to require to really build and scale a brand, whether they go into professional sports or whether they go into professions or business or whatever the case may be. I remember years ago when I started working with the Miami Heat, and it was the first time I was doing a media training for the NBA, and it was with the Heat, and they had a stellar team. And I said, I introduced the concept of brand, and none of them really reacted to it except Shaq, who raised his hand and he says, I want to build the first sports billion-dollar personal brand. And he was like the only one who had his head around it. And I think that there's a lot of that even right now. It's like, if you're on a football team and you've got 85 other guys, and it's like you want to build, they spend all this time building chemistry and trying to get them be one of a team. And then I'm supposed to think about being distinctive as a personal brand. How does that work? How does that, it's much like, right now with the election, I'm not sure when this is going to air, but we're 2 weeks, little less than 2 weeks prior to the presidential election. And there's a lot of conversation about how do a husband and wife coexist in a family when they're on totally opposite sides of this. Well, the same holds true for student athletes, and especially with the NIL. It's like they're saying, all right, you can build your brand and you can make money off your brand. I know coaches are beside themselves about what that's going to do to the chemistry of the team. And, is it going to provide opportunities for quarterbacks and stellar, running backs or whatever, or and not for linemen, and what does that do to what they can accomplish together? So there's so many different issues to work out. It is not simplistic at all. On the surface, universities are making lots of money from this semester, but lots of money from the name, image, and likeness of their athletes at all levels. So on the surface, it seems fair to have the student athletes be able to make money for themselves on their name, image, and likeness. But the complications and the layers of complexity are enormous. So brand breakdown literally is about breaking down what it takes to build, protect, and scale a brand. And I'm doing weekly episodes, and I'm taking trending topics in the news and on social media and breaking those down so that they're already aware of these kinds of things, but what does it mean to a personal brand? How can they apply the lessons learned from that situation, good or bad, to their own personal brand? And what will it take? Kelly, if you think about the resources it's going to take for an athletic department to provide, to support personal branding for any number of student athletes, and they're going to need, within an athletic department, more people, different skill sets, and it's going to, and they're going to have to make decisions like, are you going to let a player be on the sideline with his or her phone taping their teammates and putting it up on their personal things? It's just enormous, which means it's really fun for me because I have to think through all those issues.
That's so interesting that you said that Shaq had that big of a vision even back then. And I'm glad you brought him up, because I think there's people out there that don't realize you were responsible for getting Shaq on Twitter. How did you convince him that he needed to be on that platform?
Well, it's really funny. I instinctively knew this was 2007, so it was really, really early in social media, and certainly in for Twitter. And I instinctively knew that it was the right platform for Shaq because he is so spontaneous and fun, and he has a breadth and a scope that a lot of people never knew before he got on Twitter. So what happened was I kept saying, you need to be on Twitter. No. And then one day I had developed a social media listening platform just to monitor my clients and be able to give them better advice based on what was happening out there. And I saw Shaq on Twitter, and I'm like, I texted him. I said, Shaq, did you do this and not tell me? And he said, no, call the lawyers. And I'm like, no. You're going to go on and you're going to be your larger than self, life self, and you're going to obliterate this other guy. So literally, within 2 days, he was on and had 23,000 followers, which was enormous at that time. And I called the NBA beat writer at the New York Times, and I said, this is the real Shaq on Twitter, because his username was the real Shaq, because there was this fake guy on there. And the writer for the New York Times said, what's Twitter? That's how early it was. And when I talked to, every time we were going to do something significant, which was often in terms of NBA All-Star Game and all kinds of stuff, I would call Ev and Bizdone, the founders, and I'm like, now Shaq is going to do something big. Be prepared. We can't have the whale fail, come up at the time. And later they said that his entrance on Twitter actually took it out of the hands of the geeks and put it into the hands of everybody, because he wasn't just talking about basketball. As I told his manager, I said, he said, why is he doing this? He's not making any money from it. I said, because we're going to build his brand globally. He says, he's already a global brand. I said, he's a global brand in basketball, not beyond. And so some of his best tweets and posts and everything that really revolutionized not just Twitter, but social media and sports, where when at 5 o'clock in the morning, he tweeted that his little boy woke up having a nightmare and he was sitting on his lap and he said, Daddy, what do what do you think about, do you have nightmares? He says, I have dreams. And so what that was, it humanized Shaq as this massive guy, celebrity, but being a dad with a vulnerable child and getting up in the middle of the night with him. So made him almost like an everyman. And at the same time provided inspiration because he says, I don't sleep, I dream. And so people could take so much more from that. So he was just ideal for it. And it was really, really fun. And as I said, it revolutionized social media and the importance of it with sports, as well as providing a vehicle for everybody to talk about themselves and the things that drive them and the things that occur to them in a way that other people can connect with.
You yourself are very active on social media. The other day you posted that great is the new mediocre. What did you mean by that?
So the public and the consumers have been exposed to social media now for many years, and everybody's upping their game. And if you've got, it's one thing if you have 10 followers or 10,000 followers. When you're scrolling through a feed, we call it thumb stopping. Your content has to be thumb stopping. And it being great on social media isn't enough anymore. The innovation, the level of innovation that is required to be thumb stopping in any way, shape, or form, to make sure that people see you in their feed of thousands who they're following, is so much higher. So the bar has changed. And that means that brands, personal and organizational, have to be much, much more than great. And they've got to evolve with the environment around them.
You started your career as a TV news anchor and reporter and talk show host. Then in 1989, you transitioned to being a corporate communication strategist, training athletes, entertainers, and Fortune 500 companies. What was the impetus behind that transition?
So this is going to blow people's minds. It's supposed to be, the feminist out here. My husband wanted to start a business. I was working with, being in the celebrity sphere, being on television as one of the only women in television at that time. And he was going to start a business building housing for the poor in rural areas of the South. So after a year of talking me into it, I finally said, okay, let's go. And we went down south, and I had our 2 kids and stayed home for 3 years and thought my brain was going to mush. And so I thought, well, I'll start a business and I'll work 1 or 2 days a week. And I've always been into communication and what that takes and what that looks like and sounds like and feels like. And I thrive on like being in the news, knowing what's next and being there. And I started my business, and the first year I had 34 speeches or training sessions. The second year I had 105, and the third year I had 150. Wow. And I was like ready to fall apart, but I had no vision for what it could become. I just knew this was something I loved and that people needed it. Because in the news business, and I wasn't on the sports side, I was in the news side. I vividly remember walking into a bank president's office to do a story about economics that I knew very little about. My understanding was as basic as could be. But when I walked through the door with the camera person and the mic and the lights and everything, I saw him shrink. It was like, oh my God. And I realized the power that there was being on that side of the camera and the mic. And I realized that there's so much incredibly important information that experts have out there, and they don't know how to articulate it, or they don't have a vehicle to distribute that to the people who really need to know it and do something with it. And so that's what was behind starting my business. And then after 4 years of working with corporate executives and government officials and military types and so on, C-level execs, my brother won the Daytona 24 hours. He was a race car driver. And he got out of the car and he sounded like an idiot. And I knew it had nothing to do with wanting to help his sponsors, or, he was in the factory car, and it wasn't his intelligence. Might have been his drained psyche at the time. But I realized that while corporate and business people and government people may need what I'm doing on a weekly basis, in sports, they needed it every single day. Mm-hmm. So I turned around and started a division, Sports Media Challenge. And I went to Notre Dame and I said, you've got the best student athletes and coaches, and they're intelligent, and you've got all this exposure. Let me conduct a media training program for your student athletes and coaches. And if you like it, tell the world. If you don't like it, you never heard of me. Well, it happened to be the week before the NBC deal was announced, and they had not prepared the student athletes to respond to that. And that was monumental at that time. And so we used that workshop literally to prepare the student athletes, and told them for the first time where the money was going to go, why it was good for not just sports, but good for academics as well. And soon the NCAA news, Notre Dame did it, so everybody needed to do it. And then 6 months after that or so, the Lisa Olson situation in the locker room at the Patriots occurred. And I wrote a letter to the commissioner of the NFL and said, you need me. You need to teach your athletes and your coaches how to deal with the media, women and male, media in general. And they literally, Pat Summerall and I voiced a training tape that I had done, Winning the Media Game, a guide to NFL players, and took it out, and that became the first media training for the NFL. And then after that, somebody came to me about the Olympics and Dan Jansen, and you know what sports is like. It's very almost incestuous, very small circles of influence. And when you break through, it takes a while to break through, but when you break through and they trust you, you're golden.
It blows my mind, Kathleen, because at one point in your career, you were working with what you call the 3 Ps: Peyton Manning, P. Diddy, and the Pope, all at the same time. How memorable was shaping the strategy of each of those brands?
It was probably as fun as anything could possibly be. What people CEOs, I remember the then CEO of KPMG said to me before I started, every time we'd work together, which was often because I was his personal communication coach, he would say, all right, who are you working with at the PGA? It was always who I was working with in sports first. And the sports people would all say, tell me about the corporations you're working with, because both wanted a piece of the other. And people would ask me, what's the difference between the CEOs and the athletes you work with? And I said, the uniform. That's the bottom line. They all had the same fears, the same challenges. The issues may have been different and the timing may have been different, but what they needed to accomplish their goals was the same. And when they found, and this is something that I'm talking in Brand Breakdown about, that you have to encircle yourself with people who will tell you what's real, not what you want to hear. They won't suck up to you. They won't, they're not the fanning the flames of, because they're the fan too. And the reality is that, whether it's an elite athlete or coach, or it's a C-level executive, the same needs are there in terms of communication. And so it was really fun because P. Diddy was launching his music network, and I got a call out of the blue. I was recommended and talked to him and went out there and worked with him to launch, to prepare him for all the media that was going to surround the launch of his music network, which was huge. The people at the Vatican contacted me and said, how can we take what you're doing in sports and entertainment and apply that to the church to better connect with young people? So I was then hired and to literally create the social media around the Pope's visit to the United States, which was, I had 60 millennials at the time, influencers who were 30 were on site, 30 were off site, creating and analyzing and everything, and helping the Vatican better understand how to make the most of the situation for the Pope. And Peyton now has been my client for, I think, 24 years. Wow. I was brought in by Tennessee to work with the football team, and it happened to be the week of the Ole Miss game. And so obviously with their connections, his connection to Ole Miss, he really needed to prepare for that. And I spent time alone with him after the team meeting. And a week later, Archie called me and said, Peyton's got to make a big decision this year. And would you help us? He's got to decide if he's going to stay in college one more year or go pro. And so that was the beginning of my work with Peyton. And it's been an incredible, incredible ride. And I'm going to share a lot of these stories with Shaq, about Kevin Love, about Peyton Manning, about Venus and Serena Williams in the Brand Breakdown series, so that they can hear the stories that matter. So, for instance, with Peyton, when he decided, he was going pro and what his brand was going to be, because it wasn't at that time what he wanted it ultimately to be. How do we approach that? And what can you learn from that? To Shaq and surrounding yourself with people who will tell you the truth. I remember the first time I was working with Shaq about public speaking, and he had this teeny little soft voice, and I'd go in the locker room right after a game and people were just crowded all around him, reporters, because they had to get their mics closed because he talked so softly. And I'm like, oh, this is ridiculous. Here is this 7'1" man with a 23 size shoe, and he can't even speak up. So I had him turn against the wall and speak. And I was on the other side of the room, and I'm like, louder, louder, louder. And I said, all right, good. That's where your volume needs to be. And he turned around and I said, your problem is you have lazy lips. And he burst out laughing and he said, she called me lazy. And I said, no, I didn't. I said, you have lazy lips, and that's what you need to work on. So, I'm going to share stories with direct. How do you apply it to yourself? What does this mean to you, and why should you care?
When you started, and even today, when you start working with new athletes and entertainers who are very high profile, like a Shaq, like a Kevin Love, like a Serena Williams, how do you get them to initially trust you? When you're sort of brought in and they don't know you and they don't know maybe what to make. You've obviously become highly recommended, but there's still that gap where you have to earn their trust.
Yes, you do. And being honest with them, first of all, having the background. So I never talk about something I don't know. And a lot of people do, quite frankly, or that they know it on the surface only. So having that background, having recommendations of working with other people like them or in a situation. I remember vividly that one of the lead reasons that P. Diddy hired me was because they figured if I could work with celebrity athletes, I could work with him and not do the suck up factor kind of thing, and do it quickly, because there's always a time management issue with people in that caliber. But it's a matter of listening to them first. And a lot of people don't listen and digest, and then pushing them just, they'll say something and it'll sound like it's the expected answer. I'm like, well, what about this? What about that kind of thing? And once they trust you, then it's good. But the other thing is, when people ask me to compare executives and athletes, I get a couple of questions. First of all, why would someone like Peyton Manning want to work with someone like you? And I said, because the best always are looking for that little bit of difference that's going to make them that much ahead of the competition, and are constantly working. Never think that they've gotten there. They still have somewhere to go. And so by bringing new content and new approaches to some of the current challenges, so that you're evolving while they and their sports and the situation's evolving, adds a lot of trust and credibility, and enables somebody like a client like Peyton to stay with me all these years, because I'm still bringing something new and of value to him. But it's the pushback once you get there. It's saying, all right, that's not good enough. Go a little bit further. What do you mean? And pushing them until they're there, just like someone who's working with their, a trainer, in the training room with them, pushing their muscles to do, things beyond what they thought were possible, or their mind with mental toughness, to push them to be tougher when they need to be tougher, and to the same degree. It's the same with communication. When you can push them just far enough to go, so they recognize they're going further than they've ever gone, in that particular moment, there's a trust factor that comes with that. I also think that in sports, athletes and coaches they appreciate repetition, and they appreciate routine, and as a result, when they come to me, generally they know they need help. And because I don't market myself in the normal way, I've been very, very lucky over the years to have people come to me, and so I just say, all right, they're the best students, because they will do something over and over and over again, because they know what training their muscles to do that when they need to do it does for them. And your brain's a muscle, and your lips are muscles, and all of that. So it really, there's an understanding. They understand their body and are more in tune to their bodies and their minds than the average person. And so if you can find that right place at that particular time that can help them understand it and do something slightly different and better, you've got their trust.
With Peyton, he's known for his humor. He has a sort of legendary humor. Is that something that he always had, or was that something you helped draw out in him?
He is absolutely hysterical. And he always had that, but it was not something that was visible at the time. I remember his marketing agent, Zuck. He and I have worked really closely over the years. And, here is Peyton on the sidelines in the NFL, and he's looking intense, and all people could see was the red face and the anger and the frustration, because his first year in the NFL, he lost more games than he had ever lost in his entire football career before. I couldn't even talk to him on Mondays, because he was miserable. So I'd wait till Tuesday to talk to him. And he identified what he wanted his brand to be really early on. NFL came to him, and they wanted, when he was his last few months at Tennessee, wanted to do a series called Two Roads to Glory. And they were going to take a D3 player and Peyton and chronicle their path, their journey to the first game in the NFL. And Peyton says, I'm not going to do it. I said, what do you mean? They do great work. And he said, they're going to paint me as having a silver spoon in my mouth. So out of the blue, I thought, well, what 3 words or phrases do you most want the announcers, when you run out of that tunnel for the first time, to use to describe who you are? And he said, hardest working guy out there, intelligent, and I forget, quite frankly, what the third one was. And I'm like, then we're going to use this to introduce your new brand, because before that, he was known mostly as Archie's son. And as proud as he is of that, it wasn't what he wanted to define him. And so that's what I'm helping these student athletes figure out. What is going to define them? What is it going to take? What is the brand that they want to project? So as he's on the sidelines and he's showing this intensity and anger, and people are saying he's not a good, team player because he's annoyed because they're not as good as, as he is, his teammates and stuff. And Zuck and I were like, we got to get his humor out there. And Alan Zucker has done at Excel Sports, he was then at IMG, has done a tremendous job of marrying him with sponsors and situations where they could showcase his natural humor. And once people started seeing that humor, there was a balance between what they saw on the sidelines. And when he started winning more, there was less frustration. But he learned how to lead in a different way and a different kind of person. I remember years later, every year I would write a speech for him, and I would marry it to what was happening in the marketplace. And the first year, the speech was called Learning on the Run, because that's what he did. He took every snap and he learned on the run, etc. And the people out in the marketplace, in business and industry, they were doing the same thing. There was a lot of quick response kind of stuff. A few years later, every year I'd sit down at the end of the season, I say, all right, what was different that was valuable and will move you towards your goal? And one year he said, the rookie, our number one rookie, came up to me and asked me for my autograph. And it wasn't for his little brother or somebody else. It was for him, because he had watched me on ESPN Classic when I was playing at Tennessee. But now he's my teammate, and I can't have my teammates putting me on a different level like that. And he said, I realized that I had to lead a different generation, and therefore I had to lead them in a different way. So every year we'd look for what was different, that was valuable, that would move him towards his goals. And then we would build his comments for the year, his speeches around those concepts. And to have someone who was so focused on being the best at everything he did, he would prepare to the nth degree. If I wrote a line in a speech about a book or quote somebody, he'd have to read the book before he gave the speech. So he really had a depth of understanding. That's what makes me working in sports so enjoyable for me because I wasn't an athlete. I tell people I'm a great spectator, but I'm not a physical specimen. But the admiration I have for what sports does when it's at its best for people is limitless. And I've experienced that with my children. I've experienced that, with my clients, and it's made me be better too.
Speaking of the next generation, Gen Z makes up 40% of the population. Mm-hmm. They account for over $44 billion in annual spending. Why did you start wearegenz.com, which is a Gen Z research and consulting firm?
Well, I'll go back to I'm a naturally curious person, and I've wanted to be a journalist from the time I was 13. So I knew when I got out of college. I worked in radio when I was at Notre Dame and St. Mary's, and then I went right into TV. And the headline in the Syracuse newspaper was "Station Hires Second Woman." That's how odd it was at the time. But the reality was that besides my curiosity as a journalist, I loved being ahead of the curve and knowing what was going to happen before everybody else and understanding it. So I was always looking for what was next. And then in business, I spent a lot of time doing crisis management. And in crisis, if you're looking at what's right in front of you, you're going to miss what happens next. And so I'm always looking for what's next. And somehow I've always had the ability to connect the dots and even to see dots where other people haven't seen them. It's funny. I said to my husband yesterday that I was watching a news interview on TV, and I had recommended to some people who came to me about the election that if you want to get to Gen Z, go to TikTok, go to Snapchat, that they use those literally to disrupt everything, and it's important to get to the young voter. And then I saw that the Democrats and some of the more the younger politicians literally went to e-gaming and put out the vote messages in e-games and stuff like that, and on TikTok and on Twitch, etc. And I said to my husband, I guess I still have it. I said, because I told them a month ago they should do that, and they're all like, no. And they had 1.5 million people on Twitch listening and talking about the get out the vote and have a plan to vote message. And then they had 5 million afterwards watching on demand. And besides $44 or more billion that Gen Z has right now, as 40% of the population, where they go, we're going to go. And we better understand what's happening. And they're influencing over $600 billion worth of income because of what's spent within their households. So we have to get to young people. I did a survey with We Are Gen Z last year on where sports and entertainment fits in their life, and sports was only number 5 on their list.
Wow!
Because they have so many other options now, and as a result, I'm looking at my sports clients and I'm saying, you have got to cultivate this generation in a different way. Athletes have found their voice. Years ago, I was doing media training and I was in athletic departments, and I remember, I think it was the University of Texas, they said, well, the administrators said, and coaches, well, we're just going to ban them from being on Facebook. I said, you're out of your mind. They're going to be there anyway. And then I remember Tom Izzo at Michigan State, his coaches and himself and his players were in the room, and he said, Kathleen, convince me why I should let my players be on Twitter. And back then it was all, should we allow them to have a voice on anything that we don't control and that doesn't directly affect the sport and their competition? Now it's like they're speaking out on everything. Social justice is a part of Gen Z. That purpose-driven stuff drives that generation. They believe that we've screwed up this world and they're not going to let it happen. So they're going to jump right in and do it. And I was thinking yesterday, I'm going to be interviewing Rob King at ESPN later today for Brand Breakdown about they're going to have they have an election editorial approach for ESPN for the first time. Why? Because ESPN is about the intersection of sports and culture. And obviously the election is a big thing. And I started thinking, you know what? Yes, they're finding their voice and they're speaking out and they're moving the needle. However, celebrities no longer have the influence that they used to have with this generation or with the public in general. There's more authority and influence coming from their friends making a recommendation or their peers than from a celebrity because they think it's more genuine, etc., and relevant to their life. And I started wondering, have athletes come to the party too late? They finally found their voice while their platform no longer has the same luster that it used to have an influence in people's lives. And then I started thinking, all it's going to do for those who really want to make a difference is force them to do social media and do digital better. Understand that it's about creating community, not just having followers, but literally engaging with communities. And if they can build stronger, more engaged communities, they're still being leaders and they're still influencing, and then members of their community are going to go out and they're going to preach their message. And so they're going to have influence through another party, quite frankly. So, the changes are just amazing and so exciting. And we've got to understand, again, if Gen Z is going to be the largest generation out there, and they're going to be moving mountains in ways that were never moved before, we better understand them. We better get them on board. We better get them as ambassadors and evangelists of sports and of our personal brands.
Why do you think Gen Z is so misunderstood? Because when I talk to people my age or older, the things I frequently hear is they're so entitled, they're lazy. And my experience with that generation has been anything but most of the time.
First of all, they don't even know who Gen Z is, and they're still calling them millennials half the time, or more than half the time, which totally disrupts, discounts anything that they have to say. We have, since I started We Are Gen Z 4 years ago, we do original research. We have a think tank of over 1,000 real kids in the United States that we research and ask questions of, like the sports and entertainment one. I think our general response to our original surveys are anywhere from 600 to 1,300 respondents. So it's a really good group of real kids giving us feedback. And what we have found is Gen Z is anything but what people typically think they are. They're more frugal because they've seen what's happened to millennials. They don't want college debt like they have. They don't want to have to go back and live with their parents. They want to be on their own. They want to break out there. They're much more purpose driven. They are much more inclusive, and they could care less if someone's fluid or if someone's gay or if someone's calls themselves queer, or it's like, so what? They don't even notice it, and they expect brands to be like that. So the misunderstanding is just a holdover from what they've been working so hard to understand about millennials, and millennials were more like that. Gen Z is not. Gen Z is very, very different than the millennial generation. And they've got more oomph. And it's taken brands and the marketplace. They're still asking about millennials this and millennials that. I'm like, get over it. If you don't get them by now, you're not going to. Move on to the next. And the next real movers and shakers within our society is Gen Z. And you need to understand them. And they're building alliances with brands now. And they're putting their money where their alliance is. And if you don't get them now, it's going to be a whole lot harder and more expensive to get them on your side as a brand later.
Kathleen, you were at one point a NASCAR pit reporter for ESPN when there weren't a lot of women in sports media. What kinds of challenges did you have in that role that shaped who you are today?
Actually, it was really pretty cool. I would go to all my brother's races. My favorite sports were football and racing. And so I knew racing, and I'd be at all the races. And Ken Schrader was running the show. And it wasn't the NASCAR as you know it now. It was a sports driving. So my brother won the Daytona 24 hours in class 3 times, Sebring 3 times. He raced Le Mans, Fuji. So they were the endurance races. And so I was at Miami. I remember it was the Miami race, and they were racing in the streets. And Ken said to me, all right, we want to make you the first pit reporter on ESPN. And so that's literally what I did. And I put on a fire suit and I went and asked the questions that I would normally ask. He knew I knew broadcast, and I was in the business of sports at that time. So I just did it really to market my Sports Media Challenge business, and just had loads of fun because I was going to be at the race anyway. I was not great at being a pit reporter, quite frankly, but it took me all kinds of places and gave me a different appreciation for why my brother was a piece of toast when he got out of a car after driving 24 hours straight. So,
how did being one of the first female TV news anchors and the first pit reporter help normalize taking innovative risks, both then and now?
I'm really, really lucky. I grew up in a family, 5 of us kids, and every day my mother would say, almost every day, you can do whatever you want to do if you only do your best. And if your best is average, there's nothing wrong with average. We heard it so many times, we believed it. And I wanted to be a journalist from the time I was 13. So when I graduated, well, I worked in radio when I was in college, and then everybody said you should be in TV. And I thought, well, it makes a little more money. It's a different flavor. Let's try that. And just went about, I had 100 resumes that I sent out in my first bunch. And I remember thinking that I was like my friends, except that I wasn't, because my friends didn't know what they wanted to do, and they wouldn't go anywhere that they didn't know someone else. And I'm like, but you go where the job is. And I got my first job in Syracuse, New York at the CBS affiliate. And I had no credibility, none. It was interesting. I mean, basically, I was a kid right out of college. I didn't know what I didn't know. I was most comfortable wearing a pair of cutoffs and my hair in pigtails when I wasn't on the air, but I couldn't walk out of my house without being fully, credible looking. And so I had to work at credibility. Because they knew they were being very forward thinking, and they put me on air wherever they could, whenever they could. I was the first woman to anchor a primetime news show in upstate New York. I was the first woman to have a daily half-hour talk show by myself. It went on and on and on, because they wanted to show how forward thinking the station was. It was owned by Meredith Company at the time. And so I used every big word I knew because I thought that was going to give me credibility. And I always loved language. And finally, my news director, who was a terrific newsman, brought me in. He said, Kathleen, half the people out there don't understand a single word you're saying. You will be, I know, really. He said, you will be a better reporter if when you go to cover a story, you ask yourself 2 questions. What does this mean to our audience, and why should they care? Those 2 questions have driven my communication in every area since then, because it turned things around, because it helped me listen in a different way and helped me connect the dots that other people needed to have connected for them. And it's just like personal branding and brand breakdown, connecting the dots. Yes, now you can have a personal brand and you can make money from it. What does that mean? What is it going to take? What do you need to know that you don't know right now? How much time will it be? It's connecting the dots, seeing the dots and connecting them. I learned from that news director, and it has made a huge, huge difference.
For those people that are not an elite athlete or an entertainer or Fortune 500 executive, why should they care about their brand?
Because this is a different world where personal branding is crucial. If you want a job, if you want a new job, if you want to be trusted, with a passion or a purpose that you're going forward with, people have to know what you stand for and who you are when the cameras aren't on. That there is an authenticity, that there is a relevancy, and that it's not just surface. So everybody needs to understand, not just the young woman trying to get into sports broadcasting or into journalism, or the older woman who's seeing some freezing out because of age and not being getting the opportunities she used to have. They've got to reassess. How do people describe your brand today? What 3 words or phrases do you want them to ideally use to describe your brand? How much of a gap is there between those 2? And what are you willing and able to do to move the needle to this side? So it's like there are things that you can control and things that you can't control. All right, identify them and say, all right, how can I make sure that X, Y, and Z is, it is what people see and hear and experience from me, so that there's a continuity and an integration across all platforms. And because if you're creating a brand, an image, a reputation that isn't rooted in reality, you don't have to be there all the way. It can be aspirational, but there's got to be seeds of it there. Then when the stress is on, you're going to break. And it's going to be obvious that you're not who people think you are. And you're going to lose all the trust that you build up.
Last question. You've said that you are a naturally curious person. What are a couple of areas that are really intriguing you at the moment?
AR and VR, and mixed reality. I think that and AI in general, artificial intelligence and where that's taking us is really relevant and exciting. And just plain creativity and innovation. What does that mean today? Which is very different than what it means and has meant in the past. I'm an Adobe influencer, and there are 50 or 60 of us from around the world with all different range of expertise. And Adobe, it's the best mastermind circle I've ever been in, because everybody shares ideas and their expertise. And so I've learned so much more about AI and AR and VR. And I just watched the Adobe Max, their creativity conference that was virtual, and to see what the possibilities are and where people are taking creativity and innovation. We can create a different world. We can innovate. And it's going to be based on creativity and inspiration. So I want to be one of those people that provides that inspiration, that helps create the path to take us to more interesting, more fun, more meaningful, kinder, gentler world that doesn't walk away from competition, because I think competition is critical to get us where we need to go. But how we go about that and build it on creativity is going to make a big difference.
Kathleen, this was such a thrill. Your stories are epic, and thank you for continuing to be such an influencer in this world in so many different areas.
Oh, you're welcome, Kelly. You know, one of the things that I hate about all this, I love sharing all these stories, but I hate living in the past. And so one thing I would recommend is narrow your time and your energy focusing on what you did, and spend more of it, redirect more of it to what you're going to do and doing right now, so that you're more future oriented instead of past oriented. And I'm constantly challenging myself to do that as well.